October 6, 1958 was a watershed event in Bigfoot history because it was a slow news day. So much so that Andrew Genzoli's front page article in the October 5th, 1958 issue of the Humboldt Times about Jerry Crew and the huge footprints found at the Bluff Creek Road construction site was picked up by the wire service and spread like wildfire across the country. History was made and Bigfoot was introduced into American culture and vocabulary. But then there was the aftermath to deal with. And was there aftermath? Boy, howdy. Now, Michael Willie is about to dive into Lauren Coleman's take on the events at Bluff Creek in 1958. Does that mean we are closing in on the end of this series of episodes?
And there was much rejoicing.
Is that a light at the end of the tunnel? Or is it a locomotive speeding towards us? Time will tell, fellow babies. You have arrived at Bigfoot Crossing.
Good morning, fellow babies. A great day in store for you here in the metro area.
But the senator, while insisting he was not intoxicated, could not explain his nudity.
For hundreds of years, people from all walks of life have reported sightings of a large hairy animal walking on 2 feet. The scientific community has dismissed these sightings as hoaxes, hallucinations, or misidentified bears. But is there another option? Is it possible that there is an ape, the largest of the great apes, unrecognized and unclassified by modern science, roaming the forest of North America? Please join us as we seek the answer to this compelling question. You have arrived at the intersection of myth and science, of fact and folklore. You have arrived at Bigfoot Crossing.
Hey, fella. Hey, fella babies. Welcome to Bigfoot Crossing, the intersection of myth and science, of fact and folklore. I'm Michael Willie. I am your guide on this ongoing expedition. Thank you so much for being with us here today at Bigfoot Crossing. But before we dive into today's episode, let's get a couple of housekeeping items out of the way. First, I want to give yet another reminder to everyone that the Bigfoot Crossing coupon code, which is BFC15, which is found in the bookstore section of the Bigfoot Crossing web store, is not limited to books about Bigfoot or cryptozoology. The entirety of Hancock House's diverse catalog is available to Bigfoot Crossing listeners at a 15% discount. So be sure to check out Hancock House's impressive lineup of books. And you can find the Hancock House catalog by clicking on any of the images of the books in the bookstore or by going to hancockhouse.com. And be sure to use that BFC15 coupon code. And secondly, if you attended the 2024 Upper Cumberland Bigfoot Festival in Crossville, Tennessee in October and were disappointed because you could not find the Bigfoot Crossing booth at the festival, well, it's because I wasn't there as planned. I have told you in the past that I am a one-man shop, and that often includes when I go to a festival. And unfortunately, I got sick shortly before the Upper Cumberland Bigfoot Festival. And at the time, as the date for the festival rolled around, I was still recuperating. And so I was not able to attend that festival. I apologize for my absence and the devastation and despair and depression that it caused you. But I have plans to be at several Bigfoot events in 2025, so I will keep you posted on those upcoming events. Now, today we are going to continue our discussion of the aftermath of that watershed foundational event in the history of Bigfoot. The publication in the Humboldt Times of the article about Jerry Crew's discovery of and casting of large human-like footprints near the Bluff Creek work site, road building site in Northern California, and the subsequent spread of that article across the country via the wire services. October 6th, 1958, a very slow news day, part 5. And today, fellow babies, we are ready to launch into our discussion of Loren Coleman's position on this issue, as set forth in his otherwise excellent book, Bigfoot, The True Story of Apes in America. The chapter in his book about Bluff Creek in 1958 is largely based upon a 1995 article that Loren wrote for the journal The Anomalist, and that article was entitled, "Was the First Bigfoot a Hoax? Cryptozoology's Original Sin." So we will utilize both of those publications in our discussion. And now, since we have already done our deep dive into the history of Bluff Creek in 1958, with Loren Coleman, we are only interested in the why and the how. Why, according to Loren Coleman, did Ray Wallace create hoax footprints at the Bluff Creek site? And how did he do it? And class is in session. Now, let me say at the outset that I have nothing against Loren Coleman. I don't have an axe to grind with him. I do have a bone to pick with him.
What's the difference?
Well, to have an axe to grind with someone is to have a selfish reason or strong opinion that influences your opinion, a hidden agenda, or an ulterior motive. To have a bone to pick with someone is simply to be annoyed with someone about something.
Gotcha.
Now, I just said his book is otherwise an excellent book, and it is. When I see Loren Coleman on television programs, I always appreciate his contribution to that program, but he is an internationally known cryptozoologist, and he has called into question a seminal moment in Bigfoot history, and like John Green, I just happen to disagree with him. And being a lawyer, will you cut that out?
I am so sorry.
Anyway, being a lawyer, I can look at things from a different perspective from other investigators. And so just like before, we're going to look at the statements that Loren Coleman makes and the reason he gives as to why and how Ray Wallace would have perpetrated a hoax, compare that with what we know about the worksite, what investigators on the ground saw, said, and found, and apply a little common sense. And in that manner, we will weigh the evidence. Now, as I've said before, one thing I will not do, I will not substitute neither my judgment nor rumor and innuendo for the judgment of the investigators who were on the ground in 1958. I was born in 1964, so I was just a gleam in my daddy's eye in 1958. The oldest of Ray Wallace's 4 children would have been 6 in 1958, and Loren Coleman was 11 in 1958. So none of us have any business questioning the judgment of the men and women who were investigating this event almost right from the start. Unless, of course, there is evidence, not rumor and innuendo, if there is evidence that would cause a reasonable person to question the judgment of those investigators. And that's what we're going to find out. Does Loren Coleman provide us with any evidence of a hoax being perpetrated at the Bluff Creek work site? Now, Loren Coleman's book, Bigfoot, The Story of Apes in America, is a well-written, engaging book of 16 chapters. It is available on Amazon.com.
No sale.
And despite my disagreement with the author over his position on Bluff Creek, I still highly recommend his book. The chapter on sex and the single Sasquatch alone is worth the price of admission.
Hubba hubba.
Are you quite sure that topic is entirely appropriate for a family podcast?
All right, then, moving on. Turning to the article in The Anomalist on page 12 of that issue, Loren Coleman lists his research sources. He says, he writes here, in my re-examination of the earliest renderings of the Crew case, I utilized the original news items, Ivan T. Sanderson's published works on the episode, and also the rather comprehensive treatment by Marion T. Place in On the Track of Bigfoot. And then there's a footnote where he elaborates on this, and he states in the footnote, quote, some of the original news items are reprinted in Roger Patterson's Do Abominable Snowmen of America Really Exist? And then he lists the Sanderson writings that he has utilized, which is first the True Magazine article from December 1959, The Strange Story of America's Abominable Snowmen, and then a 1960 article from March 1960, A New Look at America's Mystery Giant. And then he lists Marion T. Place, On the Track of Bigfoot, a book that we have utilized extensively. Now, that March 1960 article from True Magazine, A New Look at America's Mystery Giant, focuses solely on Sasquatch sightings in British Columbia. So it's not really a lot of help when you're looking at Bluff Creek. But two things I want to point out here, and I'll tell you why later. First, note that Loren Coleman says that he utilized Ivan Sanderson's book, Abominable Snowmen, Legend Come to Life, in his research on Bluff Creek in 1958. And second, note that there's a book that he doesn't list, that he does not list. And that's John Green's book from 1968, On the Track of the Sasquatch. And that contains a chapter on Bluff Creek. And again, that is not listed in Loren Coleman's list of research sources. Now, Chapter 6 of Loren's book is devoted to the happenings at Bluff Creek in 1958 and is entitled Bigfoot Discovered. Now, let's jump right in. On page 66 of his book, Loren Coleman gives Andrew Genzoli credit for coining the word Bigfoot. And as we discussed in our last episode, that is a common mistake. Now, is it important to point this out? Well, yes, if you want to be historically accurate. The October 5th, 1958 article in the Humboldt Times clearly stated, quote, Crew said the men refer to the creature as Bigfoot, end quote. Now, that's a reference to a statement by Jerry Crew, not a statement by Andrew Genzoli. Remember, when Jerry Crew saw the footprints for the first time, and he went to the foreman, Wilbur Shorty Wallace, and reported what he'd found, there were other employees waiting at the foreman's shack to be delivered to wherever they were going to work on the job site that day. And as they discussed the footprints, Marion T. Place tells us that the operator of the road grading machine said that, quote, as long as he could remember, folks had been seeing or hearing about monster-sized footprints, end quote. That's page 30 from On the Track of Bigfoot. So folks in the Klamath area had been seeing these footprints for years, many years. Remember that Andrew Genzoli wrote in his RFD column for September 25th, 1958, that a historian in Del Norte County, which is just north of Humboldt County, the historian had sent him an article from an 1886 newspaper, which gave an account of what could only have been a Bigfoot sighting. And as Don Davis points out in his article, Bigfoot and Betty Allen, folks in Northern California had been calling the maker of the tracks Bigfoot. Don writes, quote, "Incidentally, it appears that the term Bigfoot has been used in the Klamath area by non-Indians for some time before the creature ever made the Eureka newspapers," end quote. Now, it is true that prior to October 6, 1958, no one outside of Northern California had ever heard of Bigfoot, and that sure changed when Genzoli's article was picked up by the wire services. But it seems abundantly clear that Bigfoot was what non-Indian folks in Northern California were calling the maker of these huge footprints long before the name made the papers. Now, there is a link to Don Davis's article on the episode info page. Just go to bigfootcrossing.net, click on the episode info link at the top of the page, and then click on the link for episode 11. And while you're on the website, be sure to check out the Bigfoot Crossing web store.
Shameless plug.
Coleman then has this to say about Genzoli, quote, "He was always proud that he had discovered the well-kept secret of the Hoopa Indians regarding Bigfoot," end quote. In the article in The Anomalist, Coleman tells us that this statement came from a 1994 interview with Genzoli's son, as Andrew Genzoli had passed away in 1975. So in the sense of the editor sharing in the successes of his reporters, then yes, you could say that Andrew Genzoli participated in the discovery of the Hoopa's secret. And I don't think that Andrew Genzoli's son was claiming any undue credit here. He's just proud of the work that his father had done. But discovering the secret of the Hoopa Indians regarding Oma, the Hoopa name for Bigfoot, was the result of the efforts of that intrepid grandmother/girl reporter Betty Allen. In On the Track of Bigfoot, Marion T. Place devotes an entire chapter to Betty Allen and the trust that she engendered among the Hoopa. Writing at page 48, quote, "Betty Allen, the newspaper correspondent, was determined to investigate further. She had lived long enough at Willow Creek to have won the respect of the Hoopas, a closely knit tribe of less than 1,000. Mrs. Allen was certain that if she asked the Hoopas some straightforward questions, they would give her honest answers," end quote. And as Mrs. Place reports, the Hoopa did give Betty Allen honest answers. At page 134 of Abominable Snowmen, Legend Come to Life, Ivan Sanderson put it this way: "Finally, Betty Allen, who as an old-time resident and with experience as an assistant U.S. commissioner in Alaska, started talking to the Hoopa and Yurok Amerins about these matters, and little by little, an amazing picture emerged," end quote. As I said in a previous episode, Betty Allen's contributions to the investigations at Bluff Creek have been overlooked by history, and so I just wanted to set the record straight here. Moving on page 68 of his book, Loren Coleman begins an abbreviated chronology of events. There he states, quote, "Early spring 1958, some hoax tracks are left in the Mad River area near Corbell, California. When the Corbell tracks are discovered, some folks think it might be a bear. This is another Wallace worksite," end quote. Now let's pause here for a second. Loren Coleman makes the naked assertion,
"Hey, buddy, keep it clean."
Okay, let me explain that a naked assertion has nothing to do with actual nudity.
What Well, shoot.
Issuepedia.org defines a naked assertion as, quote, a claim presented with no supporting evidence. Naked assertions are often phrased in such a way to sound informed, authoritative, and objective without actually providing any supporting argument, end quote. And that's what Loren Coleman does here. He sounds informed and authoritative while providing absolutely no evidence or any supporting argument for his contention that the Mad River tracks were hoaxed. But he tips his hand as to his intentions here by noting that the Mad River site was, quote, another Wallace worksite, end quote. Loren Coleman is using this naked assertion to buttress his argument that Ray Wallace hoaxed the tracks at Bluff Creek. But he fails to point out that, as Andrew Genzoli stated in his RFD column on September 25th, 1958, that the tracks were found by employees of the Simpson Company, not Wallace Brother employees. There were other companies working on that work site at Mad River, just like there were other companies working at Bluff Creek. Loren Coleman also trips himself up later in the chapter on page 75, where he writes, quote, the Mad River work site, another one being cleared by the Wallace Construction Company in 1957-58, had experienced giant hoax tracks earlier, but no one had dug deeper into that story after the crew report received international headlines. Somebody please explain something to me. If no one dug into the story of the Mad River tracks, how in the world does Loren Coleman know for a fact that the tracks were hoaxed? The simple answer is he doesn't. Now, can I prove that the Mad River tracks were not hoaxed? No, can't do it. As far as I know, no measurements were made, no photographs were taken, no casts were made. There is no way for me to objectively conclude that the tracks were not hoaxed. But remember what Andrew Genzoli said about the Mad River tracks in the front page article on October 5th, 1958. Genzoli recounted his phone conversation with Julian Paulus about the Mad River tracks and stated, quote, Paulus said there were 3 toes straight out and a couple of smaller on the side, end quote. Genzoli had also discussed his conversation with Paulus in the RFD column on September 26, 1958. And both times, Genzoli is kind of vague, and the description is open to interpretation, but it sounds to me that he is describing toe abduction.
You mean someone kidnapped Bigfoot's toes? Wow, talk about a foot fetish.
No one kidnapped Bigfoot's toes. You know, that's how rumors get started. Toe abduction occurs when the toes spread out away from the midline of the body.
Yeah, I get that, but who kidnapped Bigfoot's toes?
Okay, let's try this again. It appears, based upon Genzoli's vague description of the Mad River footprints, that the 2 smaller toes were seemingly pointed away from the other toes. That's called toe abduction.
Oh, yes, that's correcto.
Now, why in the world would anyone want to create false feet with toes in an abducted position? That, to me, is evidence that the tracks were not hoaxed. But as I said, there's no way for me to objectively conclude that the tracks were not hoaxed. But the important point to make here is the reverse is true as well. There is absolutely no way for Loren Coleman to objectively prove that the tracks were hoaxed. But he is perfectly willing to authoritatively tell you that the tracks were hoaxed because it supports his narrative that Ray Wallace hoaxed the tracks at Bluff Creek. That's called circular reasoning. You know, the tracks at Mad River were faked, so the tracks at Bluff Creek were also fakes. And it goes in reverse, too. The tracks at Bluff Creek are fake because the tracks at Mad River are fake. It just goes round and around in a circle without ever providing any evidence. George D. Prentice, a newspaper editor from the Civil War era, famously said, quote, "A bare assertion is not necessarily the naked truth." And fellow babies, Loren Coleman provides us with a great example of the point that George Prentice was making.
Yeah, but who kidnapped Bigfoot's toes?
You are kidding, right?
Anyway, then, rather than give any supporting evidence for his contention of faked footprints, maybe because he didn't have any, I don't know, but that's just a guess, Loren turns to a third site with allegedly faked footprints, a logging road near Trinidad, California. In the October 5th, 1958 article, Genzoli refers to a note received regarding the events at the Trinidad site. The text reads, quote, "In a note to the Humboldt Times during the week, Mrs. Paul Kesey of Pepperwood reminded us of a hoax played in the woods country. She wrote, quote, "I have read with interest the articles on the huge footprints. I recall about 8 years ago when up around Trinidad on one of the logging roads, they had a similar thing happening. This was told to me in my restaurant at Bella Vista Hill by several truck drivers. When they investigated, it turned out to be the work of a prankster," end quote. Now, Mrs. Kesey here says that they investigated. We don't know who they are, but it doesn't appear that the Trinidad footprints were subjected to a serious investigation. As far as anyone knows, no measurements nor photographs were taken, no casts were made. So all we have to go on is the word of some truckers that the tracks were hoaxed. Testimony that is relayed by a third party. In a court of law, this is called hearsay and is inadmissible. Now, in case you haven't picked up on it, Loren Coleman is desperately trying to prove a history of hoaxes at Northern California logging sites in order to circumstantially support his contention that Ray Wallace hoaxed the tracks at Bluff Creek. Now, why is he trying to do this? Because, fellow babies, he has zero direct evidence that Ray Wallace hoaxed anything at Bluff Creek. Now, when we get to the point in the chronology of events where Ivan Sanderson enters the picture, Loren Coleman spends a good deal of time and text dealing with a letter that Sanderson sent to his friend, anthropologist George Agostino. Now, in that letter, dated February 21st, 1960, Sanderson expresses some doubts and reservations about Ray Wallace. On page 75 of Bigfoot, The True Story of Apes in America, Coleman cites two concerns that Sanderson had about Ray Wallace, as he expressed in that letter to George Agostino, or as Sanderson, rather, expressed in that letter to Agostino. Quote, and this is a quote from the letter, "First, almost everybody who did not believe the tracks were made by an unknown living entity seemed to have the same idea. This was that Ray Wallace made them. The reason? That he was a great funster," and the word funster is in quotes there. "It was also hinted that he was falling down on his contract and wanted some reason to go to the contractor." Parenthetically here, Sanderson states that Wallace was the subcontractor, and say that he could not fulfill his quota and that the best way was to demonstrate that he could not get labor to go there or stay there, end quote. Okay, so in February 1960, Ivan Sanderson has developed some concerns and reservations about Ray Wallace. Now, Sanderson's article about the Bluff Creek events for True Magazine had been published in December 1959, so that ship has sailed. He can't express his concerns about Wallace in that article. But here's the thing. Sanderson's book, Abominable Snowmen, Legend Comes to Life, which includes a chapter on Bluff Creek, wasn't published until December 1961, which means that in February 1960, Sanderson had time to revise and edit the chapter on Bluff Creek to reflect and include those concerns and reservations. But Sanderson, fellow babies, did not do that. The chapter on Bluff Creek is virtually, in many ways, a reprint of the December 1959 True Magazine article. And the only reason that I can think of for this fact is that Sanderson's concerns were resolved by the investigations of John Green, with whom Sanderson was in regular contact, and, of course, our intrepid girl reporter, Betty Allen, who was also in regular contact with Ivan Sanderson. But Sanderson's letter to Agogino does reveal Loren Coleman's why. The reason that Loren Coleman thinks Ray Wallace would risk his business and his reputation to fake footprints at Bluff Creek. Ray Wallace was allegedly falling behind in his contractual obligations. Coleman even points out on page 75 of his book that, quote, federal contracts can be changed, no-cost extensions can be granted, and a variety of waivers can be allowed with good reason, end quote. Now, fellow babies, Ray Wallace had years of experience as a logger and a road builder. And let's assume, for the sake of argument, that he was having a hard time meeting his contractual obligations. Put yourself in Ray Wallace's shoes. What would an experienced, reasonable person do in these circumstances? Do you, A, go to the contractor and explain that you are working in a remote area, which requires the men to live on site while cutting a road through a virgin wilderness and up the face of a mountain, and that due to these very difficult circumstances, you are going to need additional time to finish the job? Or do you, B, plant fake monster-sized footprints in the area in the hopes of scaring off your hand-picked crew so that you can plead a lack of labor as a reason to modify your contract?
Well, I know what the answer is, Pilgrim. It's A.
Of course the answer is A. The circumstances in which the job was taking place were the perfect reason to seek a modification of his contract if Ray Wallace was falling behind on those contractual obligations. No one in their right mind is going to pull a stupid stunt like faking huge footprints to get out of a contract or obtain a waiver or extension. Or to use Ray Wallace's own words, quote, who knows anybody foolish enough to ruin his own business, end quote. And by insisting that Ray Wallace faked the footprints due to contractual difficulties, Loren Coleman either ignores or is unaware of the very real ramifications Wallace faced if caught. Now, virtually all contracts contain a clause which sets forth the grounds for which a contract can be terminated for cause. Now, I've not seen the contract between Block & Company and Wallace Brothers, but I have no doubt that the perpetration of a hoax that resulted in work being delayed would be cause for Block & Company to not only terminate Ray Wallace's contract, but to sue him for damages. And that's undoubtedly why Ray Wallace was so spittin' mad when the sheriff's office publicly named him as a suspect in an alleged hoax at Bluff Creek. But, fellow babies, the fact of the matter is, Ray Wallace was not behind in his contractual obligations. And for this nugget of information, we owe a huge thanks to who else but our intrepid girl reporter, Betty Allen. And in Chapter 6 of his book, Abominable Snowman Legend Comes to Life, page 131 in the 2006 edition, Ivan Sanderson notes that Ray Wallace was concerned that someone was trying to, quote, wreck his contract, end quote. And then Sanderson states, quote, the local representative of the Humboldt Times, Mrs. Elizabeth Betty Allen, set about to investigate the possibility on her own and discovered beyond a doubt that neither good nor bad publicity nor any kind of scare actually made any difference to Mr. Wallace's contract. First, he was a subcontractor. Second, he was more than up to schedule. Third, there was no time set on the job. And fourth, it was basically contracted by Messrs. Block and Company with the Forest Service on a performance, not a time basis. End quote. Ray Wallace was not behind on his contractual obligations, and Loren Coleman's rationale for Ray Wallace allegedly faking the tracks at Bluff Creek just went up in smoke, or maybe in the dust of road construction. Now understand what I'm saying here, fellow babies. Loren Coleman's 1995 theory about why Ray Wallace would conduct this elaborate hoax, which was elucidated on and doubled down on in his 2003 book, was proven to be wrong by a book published in 1961. And even though Sanderson's book is on Coleman's list of resources for researching the events at Bluff Creek in 1958, Coleman apparently completely ignores Sanderson's and Betty Allen's resolution of the contract question in order to push a narrative that Ray Wallace engaged in a harebrained scheme to get a contract modification. But Sanderson's February 21st, 1960 letter to George Agostino also contains Loren Coleman's how. That is how Loren Coleman thinks Ray Wallace faked the tracks at Bluff Creek. In the letter to Agostino, Sanderson relates that he had received a letter, quote, from a lady who owns a motel in Southern Oregon, which tells me that she had another Wallace brother and two other men whom she named living with her all the winter of 1958-59, who used to spend much time sitting out on the porch and doing some drinking. She reported that she had overheard them, as her office was next door, having a terrific laugh over the Bigfoot business and describing in detail how Ray Wallace had made them with their and others' assistance by making imitation feet, weighing them down, and then being hauled up and down the slopes by the new road by means of the cables they used for clearing logs out of the way. End quote. That's from page 75 of Bigfoot, The True Story of Apes in America. Now, fellow babies, I don't know who makes a better hearsay witness, the owner of a Northern California restaurant or a motel owner in a different state who was eavesdropping on some liquored-up loggers. But let me explain about the cables. In a logging operation, when the trees are felled and the branches removed, the logs are moved to a staging area by generally one of two methods. The first is the skidder method, which utilizes a piece of heavy equipment called, you guessed it, a skidder, or to be more specific, a cable skidder. Long cables are attached to the logs, and the skidder drags the logs to the staging area, which leaves long gouges in the dirt and the topsoil. The other method, the one the motel owner is referring to, is called high lead logging, in which the logs are lifted up by a cabling system and carried to a staging area. And at the staging area, using either method, the logs are loaded onto trucks and hauled to a sawmill. By the way, I have placed links to Wikipedia articles on these logging systems on the episode info page. Go to bigfootcrossing.net, click on the episode info link at the top of the page, and then click on the episode 11 link. And while you're on the site, be sure to check out the Bigfoot Crossing web store.
Shameless plug.
Now, in the article in The Anomalist, Coleman discusses the high lead logging theory and states that after the 1959 True Magazine article was written and, quote, before his Abominable Snowmen book went to press, Sanderson had the possible solution in hand as to how a heavy big-footed hoaxer could have descended such a steep slope, and that answer rests in the use of cables. According to forest industry experts, the use of cables was a very frequent practice in the West during the time of the Bluff Creek road construction. Cables were first used in the Pacific Northwest, and "get the logs up" was the cry of the clear cutters. Single tall trees were left standing, spar trees they were called, and cables ran for sometimes half a mile, hauling giant trees upward as opposed to dragging them along the ground or roads or letting them fall downhill as one might assume. So Sanderson in 1960 had a letter in his possession detailing the exact method that would have explained how the 75-degree incline angle of the Bluff Creek footprints could have been made. Unfortunately, Sanderson apparently never looked into it any further, end quote. And that's from page 23 of Coleman's article in The Anomalist. I have placed a link to the Anomalist website on the episode information page. Go to bigfootcrossing.net, click on episode info at the top of the page, and then click on the episode 11 link. And while you're on the website, be sure to check out the Bigfoot Crossing web store.
Shameless plug.
Now, given that all that was required of Ivan Sanderson to look into the question of the cables further was to make a phone call to Ray Wallace in his Willow Creek office. "Hey, Ray, are you using high lead logging at Bluff Creek?" I submit that any concerns Sanderson may have had about the cables were resolved satisfactorily. If not by Sanderson himself, then certainly by our girl reporter Betty Allen, or John Green for that matter. Now, in his book, Abominable Snowmen, Legend Comes to Life, Ivan Sanderson states that he visited the Bluff Creek worksite in 1959, and undoubtedly he saw for himself whether high-lead logging was in use at that worksite at that time. And to get an update on that question, it was a simple matter in February of 1960 for Sanderson to call John Green or Betty Allen and ask them to check on that matter, to check with Ray Wallace. At any rate, the evidence that the question was resolved satisfactorily in Sanderson's mind is seen in the fact that the chapter on Bluff Creek in the book mirrors the True Magazine article that was published in 1959. And remember, as mentioned earlier, Abominable Snowmen, Legend Comes to Life was not published until December 1961, giving Sanderson more than enough time in February of 1960 to confirm the presence or absence of high lead logging at the Bluff Creek worksite. Now, Jeff Meldrum addresses this rumored system for hoaxing Bigfoot tracks at page 67 of his book, Sasquatch Legend Meets Science. Dr. Meldrum writes, quote, "It was rumored that Wallace had somehow rigged logging cables and a spar tree to hoist concrete-weighted feet up and down the hillsides. Never mind that the original claim is that the hoaxing was accomplished merely with strap-on wooden feet. The problem is that such high-lead apparatus requires heavy equipment, including a noisy diesel engine that eats fuel and inch-thick cables. It would likely require at least 5 men to operate, relying on hand signals that would be impossible to see in the dark. Such equipment is dangerous to operate under the best of conditions, let alone at night. Wallace knew the risks all too well through personal experience. The simple fact remains that there was no high-lead logging operation on the Bluff Creek construction site," end quote. Again, that's a quote from Jeff Meldrum's excellent book, Sasquatch Legend Meets Science, which is available at Amazon.com.
No sale.
Now, if it's not in your library of Bigfoot books, it needs to be. I highly recommend it. Now, how does Jeff Meldrum know that there was no high-lead logging equipment at the Bluff Creek site? Well, because John Green confirmed it in his book On the Track of the Sasquatch, which was originally published in 1968. I have a 1973 edition of On the Track of Sasquatch in standard paperback size, and I recently acquired a 4th edition printed in 1971 in the original 8.5 by 11 format. At page 27 of the 4th edition and page 44 of the 1973 edition, John Green states, quote, "But in 1963, when for the first time high lead logging was tried in that part of the country, Bigfoot was back. Apparently, the sight of logs flying up the hill with one end in the air really roused his curiosity because for a while the tracks were around the machines every night," end quote. That's why I told you to keep in mind that On the Track of Sasquatch was not on Loren Coleman's list of resources used in researching the Bluff Creek events in 1958 for the article in The Anomalist. That one sentence blows a Bigfoot-sized hole in Loren Coleman's theory of how Ray Wallace could have created faked footprints. So once again, a portion of Loren Coleman's theory on the events of Bluff Creek has been debunked by a book that was published years before he wrote the article for The Anomalist. And just like that, the method that Ray Wallace was supposed to have used to hoax Bigfoot tracks at Bluff Creek turns out to be a physical impossibility due to the lack of necessary equipment. And even if there had been high lead logging at Bluff Creek, it would still have been an impossibility to use that apparatus safely in the dark. Of course, as with all these theories that require the use of motorized equipment, with the campsite just a mile or two down the road, the crew would have heard the operation of the equipment and would have come to investigate. But I must say, fellow babies, that I am dumbfounded that Loren Coleman failed to take the very simple yet very crucial step of confirming whether or not high lead logging was used at Bluff Creek in 1958. I mean, with so much writing on that question, wouldn't you want to confirm your theory before putting it into print?
Hello, mate. That's right.
Well, who could Loren Coleman have checked with? Ray Wallace is out because in Bigfoot, the True Story of Apes in America, Loren Coleman states that Ray Wallace's wife would not allow him to interview Ray. And maybe not Jerry Crews since he died in 1993, but there were several people on the ground in Bluff Creek in 1958 that Loren Coleman could have reached out to. Ed Patrick, John Green, Bob Titmus were all still living when Loren Coleman would have been researching Bluff Creek for the 1995 article in The Anomalist. But it seems that Loren was content to rely on an eavesdropping motel owner and an expert's generalized statement regarding the frequent practice of high lead logging in the West as support for his contention that Ray Wallace used high lead logging cables to fake the Bluff Creek footprints. I honestly just don't get it, fellow babies. But we'll move on. Now, there is one other item to consider and examine in Loren Coleman's Ray Wallace faked the footprints at Bluff Creek theory. And that item is what Loren Coleman calls Ray Wallace's confession. And that's where we will pick up next time, fellow babies. I know. I really thought I could finish this series up in this episode, but there is just so much information to convey. And you do want all the information, right, fellow babies?
Yeah!
That's the spirit. All right, fellow babies, that's another episode in the can. I want to give a big shout out and a big thank you to Lauren in the Public Reference Department of the Humboldt County Public Library. Lauren did a great job of tracking down articles for me in the library's microfilm archives of the Humboldt Times. And these episodes would not have been possible without Lauren's work and research. And a big thanks also to my good friends Daryl Williams, Kelly Burns, Alan Duffy, and his better half, Ellie Duffy, for their voice work in today's episode. Now be sure to join us right here at Bigfoot Crossing for our next episode. There's the bell, fellow babies. Thanks so much for being with us here today at Bigfoot Crossing. Now get out of here.
We hope you have enjoyed your visit with us here at Bigfoot Crossing. The internet home for Bigfoot Crossing can be found at www.bigfootcrossing.net. Michael Willie's website, Bigfoot in Tennessee, can be found at www.tnbigfoot.net. Please follow us on Facebook at Bigfoot Tennessee. You can also follow Michael Willie on Twitter. His handle is at Michael B. Willie. Each episode of Bigfoot Crossing is posted to the Bigfoot Crossing YouTube channel. Please subscribe so you can be notified when new episodes are posted. Your feedback is always welcome. Please email questions and comments to tnsasquatch@gmail.com. Be sure to let us know which episode you have a question or comment about. Thanks for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you next time right here at Bigfoot Crossing.
This is Brock Whitmore, live on the scene. Sir, did you see what happened?
Yeah, did.